Last June, I was on a business trip in Silicon Valley when a second cardiac device failed. Same problem with a second surgical team 6 months apart. The full story I cover over on philmckay.com. We'll have a link in the show notes below if you want to read all the details. What changed everything was one doctor who stopped treating what everybody else had diagnosed and asked whether they even had the right problem. That one question uncovered what two surgical teams had totally missed. That's the expert trap. And it shows up in your business, your career, and your decisions far more than you would ever expect. Before you act on that next expert recommendation you receive, there are 3 checks almost nobody make. Stay with me because one of them is going to feel, trust me, very uncomfortable. That's the one that matters most. A friend of mine ran a mid-sized manufacturing company a few years ago. He'd hired a well-regarded industry analyst, like most startup companies and medium-sized businesses looking for that advice. The analyst had the data, the slide decks, the client list that made you feel like you were in good company just for being in the room. He pointed to 3 companies in adjacent categories that had shifted to direct-to-consumer sales and had won big in their markets. He was confident, he was credible, and he was paid well to be both. And my friend followed the advice. He put together a team, built an infrastructure, and ran the channel for 22 months. Guess what happened? He lost around $4 million, and his best wholesale distributors felt abandoned, and some of them never came back. The analyst wasn't really wrong. Direct-to-consumer had worked for those other companies. The data was real, and the success stories were also real. But nobody in that room ever asked whether any of those success stories involved his specific customers, his markets, his specific products, or his type of buying cycles. The companies the analyst cited were consumer brands. My friend's company was in the industrial supply industry. Completely different purchase decisions. He'd actually noticed this early on, and something kind of felt off, but he never said it out loud because the expert had already spoken. That's the feeling I'm talking about. You notice something doesn't quite fit, but you don't raise it. You don't ask the question because who are you to question the expert? That's the expert trap. It's one of the most reliable ways your thinking gets replaced without you realizing you'd handed it over. When you perceive someone as having more relevant knowledge than you do, your brain measurably reduces the cognitive effort it puts into evaluating what they're saying. This has been studied. It's not a weakness or a character flaw. It's a shortcut your brain has developed because trusting domain expertise is usually the right call. The cardiologist probably doesn't know more about your heart than, or does know more about your heart than you do. And the structural engineer probably does know more about load-bearing walls than any of us do. The shortcut works often enough that it sticks. The problem is what it skips. It doesn't feel like you're surrendering your judgment. It feels like being informed. And so you follow advice that was right, just not for your situation or your timing or your constraints. The advice was calibrated for circumstances that don't match yours. And the moment the credentials appeared, your evaluation stopped. You accepted the expert. The wrong takeaway from everything I've said is to become reflexively skeptical. You don't want to be an overly skeptical person. You don't want to walk into every expert conversation looking for that angle or ready to push back. That's just a different way to stop thinking. The goal isn't distrust. The goal is to stay in the evaluation while the expert is talking instead of handing it over. You don't want to be passive. You want to be active in that discussion. There are 3 checks that help you do exactly that, and any serious expert should be able to answer them without hesitation and without feeling offense. So, what's the check one? What is the context? The first one is one question where specifically, has this worked before? Simple question. Give me the context. Where and when has this worked before? Most people ask whether something works, and most experts answer that question confidently. But that's actually not the full question you want to ask. What actually matters is whether it worked, what kind of organization, what stage of growth, what kind of customer, what competitive environment, what were the specific circumstances that your example where this idea worked, so we can look at it and compare. Expertise is built on pattern recognition, developed inside a specific set of situations. The pattern is real, but whether your situation matches it closely enough to actually apply it is a completely different question. And it's the one nobody asks. Even in medicine, good surgeons will tell you that outcomes from major clinical trials don't always replicate cleanly when the patient's profile differs. Age, backgrounds, starting health, exercise levels. It differs across from the trial population that the study was done in. The research is real, the expertise is real, but the fit question is what determines whether any of that expertise is actually useful to you right now. Most advisors don't volunteer this, not because they're trying to hide anything, but simply because nobody asks. So, ask. Just simply and directly. Where have you seen this work? And where does that situation differ from ours? A good expert has thought about this already. The answers come quickly, and it's specific. If they get vague or keep circling back to the general principle instead of the specific situation, slow it down, because that vagueness is telling you something. Let's move on to the second check you should do, and this is the incentive check. Now, the second check is the one that's going to feel uncomfortable, but ask it anyway. What does the expert gain from this recommendation? Every expert operates inside of some form of an incentive structure, and that's just how life works today. A surgeon recommends surgery more often than a physical therapist does, not because the surgeons are corrupt, but because surgery is the tool surgeons have. A financial advisor who earns commission on certain products is structurally more likely to recommend those products. A consultant whose business model depends on long engagements has different incentives than one whose model is based on outcomes. None of this makes the recommendation wrong. It just makes it something you need to understand before you weigh in and make a bad decision. The way to surface this without it feeling like an accusation is to ask about the logic rather than the incentive. Ask them to walk you through why this approach rather than the alternatives they considered. Think about it this way. If a mechanic quotes you a repair and you ask why that repair instead of a simpler one, you expect a real answer. You get that answer from a mechanic you trust. You should expect exactly the same from every expert in your life, regardless of how much more impressive their office is or their title is. Before you get to the third check, think about the last significant decision you've made based on expert input. Look, we talk to experts all the time. Plumbers fixing my house, or mechanic working on my car, or one of my researchers working on advanced fiber optics, right? Could you answer the context question yourself? Could you answer the incentive question? Do I really understand what is it about how they're incentivized? Most people can't. I can't. I don't know if the plumber is getting a kickback on a new pump from a manufacturer that I just don't know about, and that's why they recommended that pump? Couldn't tell you. Because the checks never happened. I didn't do the check. I'm just as big to blame for not following my own advice all the time. The third check is the one I almost never see anybody use. And in my experience, it is the most revealing of the three. This is about failure rate. The third check is, when doesn't this work? Think about what every expert presentation looks like. Track record, success cases, confidence. The whole architecture is built around what worked. What failed almost never comes up unprompted. But any expert who has used a recommendation enough to believe in it has also seen it fail. They know where it falls apart and what the warning signs look like. That knowledge is exactly what you need, and it's almost never volunteered. So ask for it directly. When have you seen this approach not work? And what tends to produce a different outcome? Now, the doctor I mentioned at the top, Dr. West, that actually is the question he asked. Not how to treat this condition that I was having better, but whether they even had the right diagnosis. Every other expert had followed standard protocol, standard best practices for my particular condition. He asked, when does the standard of care fail? He found one paper describing one edge case that had been sitting in literature for years. That question uncovered what 2 surgical teams in 3 previous surgeries that I had been through had totally missed. That's what the failure rate check does. It doesn't surface doubt, it surfaces evidence. And an expert who can only tell you what worked hasn't really thought carefully about when it doesn't. That's someone selling a recommendation, not helping you to make a good decision. So here we go, 3 checks: context, incentive, and failure rate. What do they do together is relatively simple. They require the experts to give you something you can actually examine rather than something you're simply being asked to accept. That's the difference between making a decision and receiving one. Now, you already know which of these 3 checks you struggle with to make, or the ones that maybe you're uncomfortable to ask. I'll tell you the one I'm uncomfortable to ask, and I need to get better at it, and that's the uncovering the incentive. Is there something that's incentivizing the expert to give me a very specific recommendation? And how do I tease that apart without sounding like an accusation? That's the one I struggle with. But the one that you struggle with, that's the one worth starting with. Now, this friend I mentioned at the top, the one who spent 22 months and $4 million on a channel that was never right for his business. Now, I talked to him afterwards. He admits that he knew something felt off from the very beginning. He noticed the mismatch, but the confidence in the room, the slides, the client list, all of it washed that feeling away. And he said, I knew enough to ask the question. I just didn't know I was allowed to. Let me be clear. You are allowed to ask the question. You have permission to ask the question. You should expect yourself and push yourself to ask the questions. Now, what I'm interested in hearing from you is drop me a comment and tell me which of the 3 checks is the hardest one for you to make. I want to know if it splits the way I think it does. As I've shared, the one I struggle with is the one on incentive. Which one do you struggle with? And with that, we're going to wrap up today's show. Greatly appreciate you taking the time. Remember, the ideas are not the hard part. Making the call is. Make the decision, move forward. Standing still is not a strategy. That's avoidance. And with innovation, ideas that are not executed are a hobby, and we are not in the hobby business. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.